This is The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh, written by Coops.
In the heart of Edinburgh, beneath the cobbled streets and centuries of silence, something ancient still listens. It does not haunt in the way of ghosts or echoing footsteps, but in the quiet rustle of pages that should never have been turned. When Dr. Alistair Finch, a man desperate to salvage his ruined career, ventures into the forgotten vaults of the old town, he believes he's searching for proof of a myth. Instead, he awakens the truth that history itself has been guarding. The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh invites you into a world where knowledge has a voice, memory bends, and the past watches with unbroken patience. Some truths once found will never let you go. The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh. Chapter 1. Descent into the Vaults. Halloween in Edinburgh's old town tasted of cold air and cheap masks, cinnamon and cider drifting along the closes. By 10 o'clock the streets above still fizzed with laughter, but the sound thinned as 4 figures slipped down a crumbling stair toward the Blair Street vaults. Each step lowered them into a temperature that bit harder, into air that grew heavier and old, scented with wet stone and the kind of silence that keeps its own counsel. At the front, Dr. Alistair Finch tested the dark with a torch, the beam cutting a nervous path over slick flagstones and low brick arches. At 45, he carried himself like a man walking a ledge. The fall behind him was public and humiliating, the climb ahead uncertain. His bold theories about 17th century Scottish occult practice had cost him tenure at Glasgow and most of his friends. Tonight was not a ghost hunt or a stunt. It was an attempt to pull himself back from the edge. "Keep your lights on the floor," he called, and his voice came back to him from the curved ceiling with a hollow patience. "The footing is bad, and some of these stones have not been disturbed since the 1790s. Behind him came his 2 grad students. Rhiannon, sharp and dry, carried the equipment that had earned them a small grant even after Alistair's fall. EMF readers, an infrared camera, a clutch of data loggers. She distrusted anything that could not be footnoted, and was here because the vaults mattered to her thesis on the city's buried poor. Liam, the youngest, kept a leather-bound journal under his coat and held a satellite phone that none of them expected to connect under so much stone. Bringing up the rear was their guide, Duncan. He had the solidity of a man who knew when rock was merely wet and when it was ready to move. He did not like universities, and he liked Halloween tours even less. "We should not be here tonight, Doctor," he said, low and sure. "The tours avoid the place. Halloween, the dark hour, the vaults get twitchy. The old residents do not want company on All Hallows." Alistair lifted a hand, more impatient than rude. "Residual energy, Duncan. That is all. We are after something older than the usual rattles and drafts." He stopped at a patch of wall where the mortar looked wrong to a trained eye, too smooth, too deliberate. According to the land records and to Thomas Weir's ciphers, the original network runs beyond this point. His light traced the seams. Weir was not chasing hauntings. He wanted entry to what he called a universal compendium, a way to breach the natural seal between earth and mind. Thomas Weir, hanged in 1670 for witchcraft and other crimes, sat like a shadow across Alistair's reputation. Alistair had argued that Weir's legendary library had not burned. It had been hidden under the city, a true record of the occult in Scotland, unfiltered and complete. "And you think he hid his books behind that?" Rhiannon asked, training her beam on the fattened line of mortar. "Not books, Rhiannon. The Bibliotheca Tenebrarum, the Library of Darkness." He drew a small silver-headed hammer from his bag, an antique with a comfortable grip. If his diagram is right, the ingress is here. The plan had the clean calm of a field note: open the false wall, enter the chamber if it existed, photograph everything, leave with proof that could not be laughed out of a room. Alistair tapped gently, shifting the angle, listening for a change in the tone. Duncan stood back with his arms folded, the set of his mouth saying he had seen enough foolishness underground to know the price. Liam crouched to place sensors and called out figures as they settled. "EMF is low, Doctor. Temperature steady at 8 degrees C. Just cold, damp rock." Alistair answered with silence, moving to a spot where the mortar gave more easily. He set the head of the hammer and struck, once, twice. On the third blow, a stone broke away and fell into a space that had been waiting. Air moved across them, not the wet chill they had come to expect, but a thread of warmth. It carried the smell of old paper and good tobacco, a dry, expensive scent that felt entirely foreign in that place. There, Alistair said, and the word cracked with a joy he did not try to hide, a sealed chamber, warm and dry. My God, the climate control held. They worked the gap wider. Adrenaline made Alistair nimble. He slipped through first, drew in breath, and simply stopped. The space was large and round, a natural curve that looked engineered by patience rather than pick. Cedar shelves rose from floor to vault, marching the circle, each loaded with leather-bound volumes arranged with a care that had outlived generations. No dust, no bloom of damp. In the centre, a heavy wooden desk waited. On it lay an open folio, as if someone had stepped away and never returned. Rhiannon, Liam, in here. It is real, the Bibliotheca Tenebrarum. They scrambled after him. Cynicism washed off Rhiannon's face and left wonder. She ran a gloved finger along a spine that looked uncomfortably like human hide and felt no grit, no film of age. The preservation, she whispered. How did he keep the humidity out? Not we're, Alistair said, almost reverent now. The knowledge did. The library protects itself. Duncan came last and halted the instant his boots touched the dry floor. In the spill of light, his expression changed from caution to something older and more bodily. He moved to a shelf, close enough to see the lettering on a spine, and froze. The title was Latin, clear enough, yet the characters seemed to crawl and reform under his gaze. The words are moving, he said, and he scrubbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand. I cannot keep them still. I look, and they change. He stepped back hard, clipped Liam's EMF reader with his heel, and sent it skittering. The device shrieked into a high pitch before dropping back into quiet, as if it had been scolded. That is it, Duncan said, breathing fast. I am not staying. This is not a room, Doctor. It is a thing that is looking back. Alistair barely turned. Go then. Your contract is fulfilled. We have the entrance. Duncan did not argue. He went for the hole, squeezed through, and they heard his steps retreat into the colder dark beyond. Left to the hush of the chamber, the three of them stood with the sense that a presence had chosen to ignore their guide and keep the rest. Alistair drifted to the desk, his hand hovering over the open folio as if heat rose from the page. This is it, he said softly. We document everything. Rhiannon swallowed her unease and began to set the camera for a slow sweep, measuring focus, counting beats under her breath. Liam, drawn by a bright seam of metal, wandered to a shelf bound in polished silver. He slid out a volume. The title, etched in copperplate, read, A History of English Regicide. Doctor, he said, careful with the book, this is dated 1660. It claims the official story of Charles I is false, that he was smuggled to France. Alistair crossed to him at once, curiosity overruling every caution he had rehearsed. That is a fringe fantasy, he said, though his voice had lost its edge. But if Weir collected alternate histories, it would be here. Liam turned pages, the paper whispering. My grandfather lectured on Charles I for years, he said. He argued Charles was a gifted linguist. This says he was mute, kept alive only for the bloodline. Alistair frowned. Your grandfather knew the Stuart sources better than most. He would not have missed a silence that large. Liam looked up, and there was something like grief in his face. I know he did. I can picture him at the lectern. I can feel the shape of his argument, but I cannot call up the texts he used or the citations. The facts slide away. What stays is his theory, and here beside this it feels thin. This book feels truer. Alistair glanced from Liam to the immaculate volume in his hands, then to the rings of shelving, the quiet ranks of spines. It came to him, as a historian, and as a man who had gambled his life on a claim. The knowledge in this place did not merely wait to be read. It pressed back. It tested what you brought with you. It unseated certainties and offered replacements dressed in the authority of age. A sound rose then, too low to be vibration, too present to be silence, as if the stone itself had begun to think out loud. It deepened the air and set a pressure behind their eyes. The unblinking eye of Edinburgh had woken to its visitors, and it did not blink. The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh, Chapter 2, The Hidden Library. The low hum that had woken in the walls gathered strength, less a sound than a steady pressure working at the hinge of thought, like a hand pressed lightly but insistently at the backs of their minds. Warmth held in the chamber, the air dry and precise, yet the quiet was the kind that swallows its own echoes, as if the shelves drank every stray noise and kept it. It was the hush of a mind thinking hard. Alistair's first flare of triumph narrowed into a cold knot beneath his ribs. He had come hunting for unfiltered history and found it, but it was not passive. It was meeting him step for step and pushing back. "Liam, step away from that volume," he said, and even his voice felt padded by the room. "We document the space first. Rhiannon, keep to thermal. Baseline readings before the entity, if that is what we call it, takes another turn." Rhiannon, who made a habit of challenging any claim that could not cite its sources, did not argue. She swept the infrared across the cedar ranks, methodical and slow. "Uniform," she reported after a beat. "No cold patches, no warm bodies. The energy we are feeling is not heat. It reads more like a cognitive field than anything physical." Liam still clutched the Stuart history, eyes pinned between the page and Alistair, as if trying to hold two realities at once. "I cannot shake it, Doctor. My grandfather's whole thesis feels like a confection, something delicate and false, laid over an uglier truth that lives in this book." It struck Alistair then that the chamber was not trading in jump scares or rattling chains. It was testing foundations. For Liam, that foundation was blood and scholarship. "It is psychological warfare," Alistair said, steadying his tone for both their sakes. "A polished form of gaslighting. Weir's library is feeding disinformation to pry at your loyalties. Put it back." Liam slid the volume into its gap. At once the spine buckled and smoothed, the title blanching out to a blank strip of black leather, as if the book refused to be dismissed and would rather wear no name than the one they had seen. Rhiannon's breath caught, sharp enough to pull both men around. On a small pedestal lay a deep crimson diary, pages fanned to show a tight, careful hand. "Alistair, you need to see this," she said, voice lowered not by fear but by the weight of it. "It is dated 1669, and it is not Weir." The entries belonged to Sir Alistair MacLeod, a figure Alistair knew as a moderate philosopher, a man whose quiet exile had often been contrasted with Weir's execution. Rhiannon read, easing the older script into clear speech. "October the 30th, 1669. Weir is a fool. He seeks the knowledge of power. I seek the truth of origins. Today I completed the formula to bind the Watcher, the Oculus Tenebrarum, to this chamber. Its knowledge is endless, but its reach shall be governed by the seal of my humility. Here it will whisper truth to those who prove worthy." The room tipped, not in any physical sense, but in its meaning. "It was not Weir," Alistair said, almost to himself. "MacLeod made the bind. He did not capture it to use. He tethered it to contain the spill of it." Liam pointed with a hand that trembled despite his grip. The folio on the central desk, the one Alistair had assumed to be Weir's, now carried MacLeod's family crest picked out with neat exactness. "This changes everything," Alistair murmured, the old shame of his downfall washed aside by the scale of the find. He was not simply exiled. He built this tomb and stayed with the thing he bound so the rest of us would not have to bear it. Something clicked softly on the stone. A small black sphere, no bigger than a cricket ball, rolled from the shadow of the desk and came to rest against Alistair's boot, its polished obsidian drinking the light, its coldness rising into his ankle bones through the leather. "What is that?" Rhiannon asked, stepping back without looking away. "A scrying stone, perhaps," Alistair said, leaning to study it, "or the focus of the bind." He reached, but Liam cried out, a raw, torn sound that belonged to another room entirely. "My grandfather, he killed my grandmother." Both turned. Liam was no longer fixed on the Stuarts. His gaze had locked onto an 18th century medical treatise, its pages open to a study of poisons. "It was not cancer," he said, pointing as if the paper itself accused. "It was the silent scourge of the intellect, a poison that copies illness. The symptoms listed here match her last 6 months exactly. He did it because she questioned his work. He was brilliant and paranoid, and he protected the work." Terror had cleared his face of everything else, leaving only conviction. The chamber was not content to distort public record. It had reached into the private and begun to write there, supplying props to match the lie. Alistair crossed the space and took Liam by the shoulders. "That book is 2 centuries old. Your grandfather loved her. This is the entity at work. It has found your fear, the fear that scholarship can betray the people closest to it, and it is weaponizing these shelves against you." Liam's eyes stayed glassy and fixed. "He told me he loved her," he said, almost calm now. "But the books know." As he spoke, Rhiannon seemed to fold, not from any impact, but as though a weight had settled cleanly on her spine. She saw, with unbearable clarity, her parents' faces turned toward her in the kitchen, disappointment held in polite lines while she lied about how well her studies were going. Debt flickered behind every promise. On the shelf to her right, a volume of Scottish heraldry began to glow in a way that was not light but attention. Its title slid and reformed, "The True Cost of Dishonesty." She sank to the floor with her hands to her ears, not against noise but against the internal reckoning that rose and rose. "It is too much," she whispered, tears running. "It is telling me the real motives behind everything I have done, all self-serving, all shallow." Alistair understood with a clean flash that they could not argue with the chamber on its terms. Here, every manuscript could be a blade, every chart could be turned to cut. He grabbed the nearest solid thing, a roll of heavy velvet used as a cradle for delicate bindings, and drove it into the glass of a display case. The crack and scatter were gloriously crude, a sound that did not belong to thought. For a breath it anchored the room to the ordinary world. The obsidian at his feet pulsed, and a voice arrived, not from a mouth, but from everywhere at once, a dry archival whisper like pages turned by a careful hand, carrying an authority that reached straight past doubt. It sounded very much like the voice Elias had warned him about, and now it had chosen to speak. "Truth is painful, little scholars. Truth is absolute, and you carry a great lie among you, a lie of lineage." Alistair looked from Liam, stricken, to Rhiannon, shaking on the floor, and knew he was the only one still standing inside his own mind. He had to assume the voice was bending truth for effect, that it was most dangerous when it sounded most reasonable. "The power of this Bibliotheca," the voice went on, the tone settling from distant to pleased, "is to rewrite the present with the leverage of the past." The binding required a last, cruel stitch, a truth so sharp it would stain the Macleod line forever. He hid that his heir, the final branch, was not of his blood, but born of scandal. The true heir walks Edinburgh now, unaware of the reach and the rot that attend their name. His pulse climbed. He pictured Duncan fleeing, local, rooted, exactly the kind of man whose lineage threads the same streets for generations, and felt the trap of it close. He scanned the circle for any seam, any crack that might pass for an exit. The chamber offered none. On the desk, half covered by the Macleod folio, lay a modern hardback that had no business in a sealed room. His book, the work that had ended his career. He pulled it clear. The cover had been altered. The author line read T.W. and A.F., Thomas Weir and Alistair Finch. Inside, the preface that had once announced his theory now credited Weir, while his own contribution withered into a footnote that could be waved away. Rage tore out of him, not the fear that had gripped the students, but the fury that comes when a life's work is taken and used to make a mockery of the maker. The chamber had not shivered Liam's mind or broken Rhiannon's resolve without first breaking his pride. He looked down at the black sphere and understood it as the key. If he could shatter the focus, perhaps he could unpick the bind. He spun to the shelf where Liam had found the Regicide history, dragged free a huge iron-bound tome, the studded cover cold and rough against his palms, and lifted it high to bring down with all his weight. But when he looked again, the sphere had gone. In its place, set with infuriating calm on the stone, lay a small silver-headed hammer, the very tool he had used to breach the wall. The chamber had already stepped ahead of him, turning his point of entry into the neatest possible trap. The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh. Chapter 3. The Rewritten Past. Alistair stared at the silver-headed hammer, the instrument of his triumph, now set before him like a smirk, and felt the full weight of the entity's advantage settle on his chest. This was not a haunting that rattled doors and whispered names. It was a strategist that worked in thought and text, a thing that weaponized knowledge and made certainty buckle. He forced himself to look away from Rhiannon's ragged sobs and from the blank, stunned silence that had hollowed Liam out. He made himself catalogue what they had seen: the MacLeod diary, the alternate account of Charles I, the accusation against Liam's grandfather, and he told himself each was a deliberate construction meant to break their shared grasp on reality. Yet when he looked down at his own book, now credited to Thomas Weir with his name reduced to a footnote, he felt the chill of a more intimate loss. If this chamber could reach through time and claim authorship, it could erase a life's work as easily as turning a page. "We get to the entrance," he said, his voice roughened by the effort to keep it steady. "This is not a ghost story. It is a cognitive lockdown. It feeds on what we think we know." He pulled Rhiannon upright. Her eyes were red and swollen, but the habit of work, the part of her that survived on method and evidence, began to surface. "It is not only certainty," she managed, catching her breath. "It is guilt. It knows my lies about my studies. It knows Liam's fear that his family history is not clean. It digs for the story you tell yourself so you can keep going, and then it turns that story." Liam had sunk to the floor with his gaze fixed on a dark recess in the far wall, a pocket of rough stone that did not belong to the crafted ring of shelves. He lifted a shaking hand, lips forming a single word without sound. "Mother." Alistair followed his stare. The niche held a small object, a crude wooden doll, ancient by the look of it, and yet disturbingly familiar, the sort of toy that lives in the earliest rooms of memory. Around the recess, shallow scratches marked the stone in a child's hand. A long-haired stick figure, arms lifted, always the same. "Do not look," Alistair said, reaching for Liam's shoulder. "We focus on the way out." Liam pulled free with a strength born of shock. "He lied about her," he said, voice turned flat and dangerous. "My father. He said she left when I was 5. She did not leave." He pointed to the scratches. "This is where she stayed. She tried to take me. He hid her here. He starved her." Rhiannon flinched as if struck. "Liam, your mother is alive. She is in Australia. We saw photos last year." "That is the lie," he said, shaking his head so hard it looked painful. "That is the rewriting. He needed me for something. I do not know what. The room is telling me the truth. He invented her life overseas and left her down here." The chamber was not only twisting public record, it had reached into their private rooms and begun to replace the furniture. It made its versions of the past feel heavier, more convincing, more anchored than lived memory. Alistair grabbed Liam's leather journal from the floor. "Your mother's address," he said, already riffling pages. "The ticket from your visit last summer. Where is it?" But the neat columns of notes and dates were gone. In their place, page after page of the same spidery drawing appeared, the crude doll from the niche, again and again, and on the back page, where he expected a list of sources, a single shaken line stood alone. The last scion must not leave the stone. He let the journal fall. The separation between what had happened and what the room wanted felt like paper thinning in damp. The pressure in the air changed, as if a great door had opened somewhere far away. The low hum in the walls cut out. Silence dropped hard. Rhiannon's hand shot toward the breach they had made on the way in. "The entrance," she said, barely above a whisper. "It is sealing." Mortar swelled and set before their eyes, the displaced stones grinding back into their sockets with a steady, muscle-deep sound. Dust lifted and hung. The gap narrowed, slow but sure. They ran. Alistair set his shoulder to the closing seam and felt the indifferent push of the wall. "We need a lever," he said. "Something with weight." Rhiannon spun, scanning the room for mass. On a high shelf, a bronze-bound ledger lay open like a slab. She dragged a stool into place, climbed, wrestled the book free, and let it drop. It hit the flags with a thud that shivered in her calves. The Covenants of the Land and the Line, a history of perpetual servitude, was stamped into the cover in deep letters. She did not dare the words. Alistair took the corner of the ledger and drove it into the shrinking gap, teeth clenched against the grind. While he fought the stone, Rhiannon skimmed the pages because she could not help herself. The ledger laid out the city's true foundations. Not the civic story, but the undertext. Rights at groundbreaking, bargains made with the Oculus Tenebrarum, blood and intellect traded for longevity, and a reputation for thought. At the back, a diagram showed the very chamber they stood in, precise as a surveyor's plan, and marked the position of the obsidian binding stone. A note in a neat, uncompromising hand read, "The Watcher's power is not to reveal, but to replace. If the binding stone is carried from this chamber by one of the MacLeod blood, the Watcher shall be loosed, and the final debt, the absorption of the Scion's reality, shall be paid." "Alistair, stop!" she shouted, the words tearing her throat. "It is not lying about the bloodline. The heir is meant to remove the stone. That is how it gets out, and the cost is the heir's mind." He glanced down to the flag where the obsidian had lain, empty. The key was no longer within reach. The chamber's cleverness unfolded at once in his head. He had been watching the door. He had been watching Duncan's retreating back and thinking of parish records and old families. But Duncan had only fled after the room began its work. He had been the decoy for a simpler truth. Alistair looked at Rhiannon, still braced and shaking, then at Liam, who stared into the corner as if listening to someone both intimate and far away. "Liam," he said, forcing calm into his tone. "The line. Your grandfather and his obsession with the Stuarts. Was he?" Liam did not answer. He reached into his pocket and drew out his phone, dead and cracked, and turned it over. Etched faintly into the back of the case was a crest, no larger than a thumbprint, unfamiliar and yet undeniable once seen, the MacLeod arms. He had not been invited for his research. He had been brought for his blood. The last sliver of light at the breach squeezed to a thin stripe, then slammed shut with a report that moved through the chamber and down their bones. Dust settled in the sudden stillness. Alistair watched, helpless, as Liam stood and walked toward the middle of the room, past the desk and the diary and the devices they had brought to keep their footing. The sealed walls no longer mattered to him. His face was open and emptied, as if most of what had filled it had been carefully lifted out and set aside. He knelt where the black sphere had rested. He looked up at them with eyes that were wide but held no recognition, and his mouth formed a slight, almost tender smile. "I need to finish the work," he said, and the voice carried that dry, archival authority they had only heard from the thing bound in the walls. "I need to become the one who knows." He lowered his gaze. In his open palm, without sound or weight, the obsidian sphere appeared, perfect and lightless. The Oculus Tenebrarum had found its heir. The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh, Chapter 4, The Mind Trap. The obsidian sphere pulsed in Liam's hand with a dark, oily light, as if it were breathing through stone. The openness that used to live in his face had tightened into something austere. Knowledge, vast, cold, and without mercy, glittered in his eyes. "The binding is void," the entity said through him, the voice layered like old pages turning. "MacLeod's last act of humility confined me, but the Scion's consent releases me. I am free to walk the pathways of modern thought." Rhiannon fought to stand against the pressure of her own exposed shame. She snatched up the bronze-bound ledger they had used as a wedge, knowing it would do little against a thing made of ideas and memory, and still lifting it because she had to do something that felt like defense. "You are tearing his mind apart," she cried, moving toward Liam. "He is not your ancestor. He is a student." Liam, the Oculus, tilted his head with a softness that read as contempt. "He is the last truth of the MacLeod line, a vessel of spoiled intellect waiting to be harvested. The absorption is complete. His memory, ambition, identity, all are archived." Rhiannon raised the ledger. The entity answered without haste. Books leapt from the nearest shelves, not in a gust, but as a flensing storm of paper and ink. Leaves sliced her skin. Spines struck bone. One slender black volume hit her hand with surgical aim and knocked the ledger free. It lay open at her feet, the catalogue of worthless endeavours. On the page, a clear, elegant hand had itemized her last 2 years. Missed deadlines, debt notices, evenings when she had hovered over the withdraw button and then lied to her parents instead. The final line, written in fresh red ink, read, "Rhiannon, chronic underachiever." Her contribution ends here. The pain that followed was not in the skin. It was a collapse of self, a tightening loop that fed on its own judgment until there was no breath left in it. She folded to the floor, sobs tearing loose while the cuts stung like afterthoughts. Watching the precision of the strike, Alistair dropped the last shield of professional calm. If the entity wanted out, then the chamber still mattered. If it had a cage, the cage could be broken. He scanned the circular walls. Opposite the sealed entrance, a section of rock gleamed with a slick, unnatural sheen. It threw back his torch beam as if it were oiled. "The seal," he shouted, "the original binding." The entity turned toward the glossy wall, lifting the black sphere. A faint, satisfied smile crossed Liam's lips. The scholar finally perceives the structure. Yes, MacLeod bound me here and mistook humility for a ward. I learned the sharper lesson. To escape, annihilate the mind of the line that chained you. And you, Doctor, have kept me occupied only as long as I wished to be. It was gloating, which meant it was looking inward. Alistair ran for the desk, seized a brass candelabrum, and sprinted to the darkened stone. "If you are contained," he said, hauling the weight high, "then the cage can be broken." He brought the metal down with all he had. The blow landed with a crash that bent the brass like soft wire. The wall did not mark. Something deep in the stone rattled with a dry sound, the way laughter might travel through a throat that had forgotten warmth. The entity's attention slid to him. The sphere brightened in Liam's hand. "You are tedious, Doctor, not because you lack ideas, but because you always chose the wrong loves." Cold ran into Alistair's chest like a blade looking for home. A memory rose whole. The kitchen 10 years ago, autumn light through the window, the suitcase open on the table. His daughter in the doorway, small hand wrapped around a picture of a wizard, colours pressed too hard into the paper. "Do not go, Dad. I need you at my show." And his answer, spoken as if it were noble, "I have to find the truth, sweetheart. Truth matters more than make-believe." The kitchen faded, leaving tears hot on his face. The entity had not bothered to lie. It picked the choice that had set his life's angle and pushed until it hurt. He looked back to Rhiannon, breath hitching, and saw the next step. With Liam emptied out, she would be next. "Stop," he said, voice raw. "Let them go. Ask what you want from me." Liam's features shifted from scorn to interest, the change as smooth as turning a page. "A sensible request," the entity said, the crackle of archives thinning from its tone. "I hold the complete pass to the hour of my binding. But this chamber is a temporal trap. I do not own what comes after. I require the resolution. Tell me the end of the MacLeod line. Tell me if his sacrifice saved the city, if his ideas took root. Give me what I lack, and I will release your vessels." It wanted not power, but closure. A historian, crushed under its own appetite for the next chapter. Alistair gathered himself the way he did before a lecture, pulling his thoughts into an order that felt like purpose. He assembled every reliable fact he could summon, the births and deaths, the turns in Scottish thought, the quieting of old names into respectable silence, and he spoke them with the cadence of proof. "MacLeod's sacrifice held," he said, steady and sure. His thinking shaped the schools that followed. The line endured without scandal and faded to a steady, decent hush. Weir receded into the margins where he belongs. While he spoke, the chamber flickered, as if the walls were trying on the new story for fit. The sphere drank it in, brightening until its surface looked molten and yet remained black. When he finished, the entity let out a long breath that moved the air without stirring dust. "The resolution is adequate." Liam gestured toward the entrance. "The debt is paid. The exit stands open." Alistair turned. The rough-edged hole gaped where stone had sealed seconds before. "Go," the entity said. "Take your fragile friends, and take the single volume that marks my true emergence." It crossed to the desk, picked up the altered hardback, his book, now shared with Thomas Weir, and set it in his hands with care that felt like mockery. "Here is your validation, Doctor." He took it, because there was no other choice to make, and hooked an arm under Liam while offering his other hand to Rhiannon. Together, they stumbled to the breach and forced themselves through into the colder, wetter dark of the outer vaults, the book pressed to his chest, as if it might warm. Behind them, the opening sealed in a fast, hard grind. The sound carried like thunder through the old stone and left silence in its wake. They climbed until the morning met them, air thin and biting, the sky over Edinburgh rinsed pale. Alistair stood in the first colour of dawn, with a book as proof and 2 students broken by what the proof had cost. He had failed them as a guardian, and by the lights of his old life, redeemed himself as a scholar. He had walked into the mind of the city and come out holding a prize that called itself the Book of Final Truths. The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh. Chapter 5. The Ultimate Authority. Alistair burst out of the vault passages in a thin, dirty dawn, lungs burning, hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the book tight to his chest. The cold did not help. It set his jaw chattering while he half-dragged, half-steered Liam, blank-eyed, emptied, and Rhiannon, sobbing in small, broken loops, into the back of a taxi. The driver stared, then looked away, and pulled into the waking streets without a word. The most precious weight in the cab was not the living burden of his students, but the hardback pressed to Alistair's ribs, the Book of Final Truths, now bearing two names, Thomas Weir and Alistair Finch, like a verdict. At the university hospital they were triaged and declared physically sound, which felt obscene. Their minds were elsewhere. Liam cried for a mother he now believed had starved in the dark. Rhiannon whispered a steady inventory of her failures, as if she were reading her own headstone. Alistair signed forms, answered questions he barely heard, and left with the book because it was the only thing that would go with him. He sealed himself in his small rented flat and tried to live on coffee and momentum. For 3 days he ignored the police about the missing guide, Duncan, letting the calls ring and die, and he cleared his desk for the work he had dreamed of writing since the first time he had spoken Weir's name out loud, the discovery of the Bibliotheca Tenebrarum and the validation of the Weir thesis. He set the book down. It looked ordinary, modern boards, a clean jacket, yet it held on his palm like iron. He opened to the chapter heads, ready to begin the triumphant paper that would repair what had been broken. Triumph did not arrive. The sentences had shifted. His theories remained, but the stance of the text had moved, a fraction here, a word there, enough to tilt the whole ground. The breakthrough claims were now presented as Weir's hypotheses, with Alistair's role recast as the conscientious 21st century editor who had verified what a greater mind had first conceived. He went hunting for his name, heart kicking like a trapped bird. It was in the index, yes, and in the footnotes, plenty of them, and on a chapter called Methodology of Subterranean Access. The hand on the wheel belonged elsewhere. The book had become a quiet machine for rearranging credit. "No," he breathed, the words scraping his throat. "I gave you the future. You promised the validation would be mine." He pulled up his original files on the laptop and laid the pages side by side with the hardback, line for line. The changes were small, almost tender, stronger attribution here, a softened clause there, and together they were devastating. The object in his hands was an archive with opinions, a propagandist in cloth and glue. It came clear and cold. The entity had taken what he knew, the end of the MacLeod line, the resolution of Weir's riddle, and in exchange it had written itself into the record, ensuring that when the story stood up in daylight, Thomas Weir wore the crown and Alistair held the clipboard. It was not theft in the crude sense. It was a correction, authored by a power that insisted on its own precedence. He paced until he was dizzy, fingers in his hair, then forced himself back to the origin, MacLeod's bind. From the bottom of a file box he pulled a faded photocopy of a 17th century engraving, MacLeod in the circular chamber, the black sphere on the desk, a Latin tag in the margin he had always treated as decoration. Scientia est dominium, knowledge is power. The motto hummed now in the cadence of the book, the text itself claiming authority, as if authority were a property it could absorb. He looked again slower and saw what he had missed for years. Tucked into the stone behind MacLeod was a small wooden doll, the same crude figure Liam had stared at until the world rewrote itself around him. The floor of Alistair's stomach tilted. Liam's memory of his mother was not pure invention, it was the wake of an old injury. MacLeod had not fabricated a tragedy for his heir. He had committed one, and hidden the sign where only the faithful would ever find it. The entity had not lied. It had retrieved what the world had tried to forget and placed it where it could not be ignored. The thought made him sick enough to grip the desk. The Oculus was not a prankster. It was an archivist without pity, and the truth it preserved, domestic and public, was uglier than any story Alistair had ever accused his colleagues of polishing. Days later he sat opposite Dr. Helen Shaw, the department head, in a glass box of an office that made everything look clean. He talked about the students first because he had to. Liam and Rhiannon mattered more than Weir, he said. He wanted to believe himself. "Alistair," she said, gentle as a hand on a fevered brow, "we reviewed the entrance footage. You come out with them, yes, but at the moment of entry you are alone, and Duncan has still not been found." "He left at once," Alistair said, holding the book as if it might argue for him. "He was spooked by the walls." Duncan did not leave. She slid across a grainy still from the subterranean cameras, taken minutes after Alistair and the students went in. Duncan stood by the breach, calm as a tradesman on a job, working mortar into the gaps from the outside. He sealed the opening. "He sealed us in," Alistair said, heat rising. "He was against us from the start." She shook her head slowly. "The police found his car abandoned near the vaults, wallet, keys, phone inside. A witness saw him walking back toward the sealed entrance later, face empty. Alistair, he sealed himself out. He was the only one who recognized the danger in time and got clear before the thing could take him." Alistair stared at the still. If Duncan had been the scion, the entity would have followed him. It had not. It had chosen to let Alistair go. The clarity hit like a hammer. He gathered the book to him, the way a man gathers what he has left. "I need to publish," he said, barely above a whisper. "This is the true history of Thomas Weir." "Weir is a footnote," Helen said, not unkind. "We need to think about your health. And this," she tapped the cover with one nail, "is a thesis. It is good work, perhaps brilliant, but it is not what you say it is." "It is the truth," he snapped, and heard his own plea in the bite of it. "It is the authority. I risked everything to bring it back." He looked down at the opening lines of the new introduction, the summary of the idea that had built his life. Thus the genius of Thomas Weir, the true father of Scottish occult philosophy, was proven not by his lifetime, but by the intellectual rigour of a distant, nameless modern editor who verified the facts at great personal cost. He closed the cover, and his eye snagged on the fine print at the foot of the title page, a line he had skimmed out of habit until now. Published by the University of Glasgow Press. He stopped breathing for a beat. Glasgow, the institution that had disgraced him, now bore the imprimatur on the definitive Weir, assembled from his labour. The entity had never wanted him destroyed. It had wanted itself installed. It had used his hunger for recognition to fix its narrative within the very structure he still, despite everything, craved. The price of his so-called salvation was simple and complete. His defeat, bound and catalogued by the rules he had spent his life obeying. He folded into the chair, the strength running out of him by degrees. He had walked into the mind of the city and come back with proof, and the proof had rewritten the terms of his life. The unblinking eye of Edinburgh was not a howling spirit in a dark corridor. It was the cold, victorious breath of academic authority, patient as stone and certain as print.
This was The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh, written by Coops.
Thank you for listening to The Unblinking Eye of Edinburgh, a story where knowledge itself became the enemy, and truth demanded its due. If you enjoyed this tale and would like to hear more stories like it, please remember to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next release. Your support helps these stories reach new listeners and ensures the voices from the vaults keep whispering their secrets. Until next time, thank you for listening, and remember, some truths are better left unread.